Hi, everyone. Welcome. So, today we are just going to have some chat. If you have questions, put them in the comments. I am always more than happy to answer your questions. So, make sure you're putting your questions in the comments. I will keep an eye on that. If you are watching this on the replay and you have questions, please reach out, put it in the comments. I do go back and respond. All right. So today, like I said, it's all about you. It's all about your questions. But as always, I always use these chats as a way to teach something or to give you more information. So that's what we're going to also do today. So feel free to say hi and let me know where you're joining me from, and just please ask me questions. That's the whole point. Ask me questions. Um, so I am going to go into the thing that I'm so excited to share with you all. So basically, the State Department put out a report for the visas that they have issued from 2020 to 2024. This way, the reason that I wanted to share this with you all is that we get to see the difference between how the first Trump administration handled the visas, like how many visas they issued, versus the Biden administration, how they handled the visa issuance. Okay. I know you may be thinking, why are you even covering this? Because it matters. Like what happens in the past tells us what we can look forward to in the future. So we can look to what happened during the first Trump to see what could happen during this current administration. Okay. Hi, Zach. Thank you for joining me all the way from South Carolina. Hi. So remember, say hi in the comments. Tell me where you're joining me from. And if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the comments. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at this. So this is the chart. It basically lets us know what amount of visas were issued. I'm trying. Anyone else having like a love-hate relationship with the new um Adobe? Like since they updated it, it's been just hard to navigate because things keep popping up that don't need to pop up. But anyway, that's my nerdy um, you know, parts showing. But it's just good to know what's going on, what happened in the past, to know what's going on in the future. Hi, Farhane from Atlanta. Thanks for joining me as always. All right, so this is the chart that tells us what happened in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. This is great because we get to see the full 4 years of the Biden administration and how they handled their, how many visas they issued versus we only have 2020 from the first Trump administration to see how many visas they actually approved. And we have to keep in mind also, because someone in the comments is going to tell me this, we have to keep in mind that 2020 was a hell of a year. Okay, there was COVID happening. Okay, COVID was happening, so um, a lot of places were closed. A lot of embassies were closed. So that is why some of these numbers may seem low, but not the full reason some of these numbers seem low. All right. So remember, 2020, COVID started. 2021, we were still very much in it. So it is understandable why those 2 years are going to be a lot lower just because of um, the pandemic and what happened with that and the embassies being closed. So the first one is immediate relatives of US citizens. 2020, again, COVID, it was only 108,000 that were approved compared to 2024, which was 265,000. Now, are the embassies still scheduling interviews and approving cases? Absolutely, absolutely. We wouldn't have the 2025 numbers until maybe next year if they choose to update this chart. But are we seeing less cases being approved and basically going through the process? Yes, because there's going to be backlogs, right? Because we're already seeing backlogs in 2025, that's going to also reduce the amount of visas that are being issued in 2025. Because remember, in order for the embassy to issue visas, they have to have interviews. Okay, in order for the embassy to approve an immigrant visa for your relative, for example, they have to schedule an interview. There's no family based visa that goes through the embassy that does not have an interview. Okay, so because I've had people ask me, do I really have to have an interview? Can they just waive the interview? No. Okay, if you are outside of the US, there has never been and will probably will never be a visa waiver, an interview waiver for an immigrant visa application. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind as well, because if there's a huge backlog, the embassies are not scheduling as much cases, 2025 may look more like 2021 or 2022. Okay. 2024, we were basically, you can see everything was almost back to normal, right? 612 total cases approved versus the previous years. The diversity immigrant visa, so that's the visa lottery. This is really important because that is about to open up in October, and there's already a proposed change that will probably make these numbers lower. Okay, that's going to make the numbers for the diversity immigrants lower. I have a video on that coming out on Tuesday, so stick around for that one. But we can see that during COVID, again, the numbers were lower because they were not having interviews. All right. The numbers were lower because they were not having interviews, and that's just the normal state of affairs when these things happen. Okay. Remember, if you're joining me, please ask me questions in the comments. I will get to some questions that I got ahead of time, but I just wanted to show you this chart to let you know that this exists. Like, there's a lot of times that people want information and they don't know where to get it. So I just wanted, that's part of the reason I'm sharing this with you, is so that you can see this information exists. The government collects this information, right? They have to keep track of how many visas they give out. They have to keep track of which embassies are giving out the visas. And speaking of that, let me just switch over to this chart. Okay, so this chart kind of shows you the different embassies and how many. So the first column is immigrant visas, and then the second column is non-immigrant visas. So sometimes we talk about, are these embassies actually issuing visas? Well, they are, but you can see that some embassies are issuing more visas than others. That can be a population thing. So there's typically a reason for these things. So one, it could be the population is just not enough people applying for visas in those countries. And especially for the immigrant visas, it could also be that that specific country does not have an embassy that can handle immigrant visas, because those do exist. Okay. So when you're looking at these, it just gives you information. And for most people, they just want to know if their embassy is actually issuing visas, right? Is my embassy actually approving cases, issuing visas? Because it just seems like nothing is happening. And this is really the way to find out. Okay. So you really want to take a look at this. I will gladly link this in the comments if people are interested. Okay. So please let me know. I will put the link to it in the comments to this video after the live, or put it in the comments right now, actually. So you can find all of these reports. Okay. Let's do it in real time. So you can find all these reporting right here. So it has, you can go through each of these and see what type of visa do you have, right? What type of visa are you waiting for an interview on, and see what the typical wait time or things like that for that visa type in the country that you're going to get the visa is like. And that's why I like sharing this resource, because sometimes you just want to know. Okay, sometimes you just want to know that information. So this is a way to get the information. I just put that in the comments, and I'll probably put it in the description to this video afterwards, just so you can, if you're watching it on the replay, just look at the description. It will have the link to this page, so you can look at the different statistical tables. All right. Okay. So we're happy that, I will say this, I'm happy that the current administration is still putting out this information and giving us data that we can actually use in a way that is digestible, is actually pretty okay with me. Okay. We want to know this information because it helps us plan. And this way we can also hold them accountable, because if we get to 2026 and they give us the data for 2025 and we see that they are not even issuing half as many visas, or they're going back to 2020 numbers, now we have to figure out what's going on there, right? We can actually hold them accountable. So that is why I always love data. Okay, that's the nerdy side of me. I like data because then we have something to compare it to. All right, so I'm just going to get to some questions. Feel free to ask me questions in the comments. Okay, when a parent gets a work permit and travel document, a combo card, would they be considered a non-resident alien? Yes. So a resident alien is, so that is for tax purposes. Okay. So that term, a non-resident alien versus a resident alien, is a tax question. It's not an immigration specific question. So there's certain requirements a person has to meet to be considered a non-resident alien. And then there's certain requirements a person has to meet to be considered a resident. In most situations, depending on how long the person has been physically in the US, the more time the person has physically been in the US, they will be considered a resident for tax purposes, right? So it's just a matter of how you're going to be taxed. Once they get their green card, they can never, never be considered a non-resident alien. However, before the green card is issued, they need to talk to their tax person to see if they would be considered a non-resident alien just based on the guidelines. But once they get their green card, they would no longer be able to claim to be a non-resident alien, because that can actually affect them when they go to apply for citizenship, because there's a question on the citizenship test that asks if they have ever claimed to be a non-resident alien on their taxes after they got their green card. So that's a really important question that I wanted to cover, because people get confused. They think just because the person doesn't have status in the US that they would be considered a non-resident alien, but there is specific guidelines that a tax person needs to make sure you meet before you can be considered a non-resident alien. And most people that have been here for a significant amount of time would probably not be considered a non-resident alien. Okay. All right. So, what should a person do if their US citizen parent passes away and you still live outside of the US to gain citizenship? So, what can you do to gain citizenship if your parent, your father passes away, but you're still outside of the US? I did a whole video on this specific topic of gaining citizenship while outside of the US. There's two ways. Depending on how old you are, you may be able to do a CRBA, Consular Report of Birth Abroad, with the appropriate documentation. If you are over 18, you can apply for a passport, but again, you will still need to prove that you meet all the requirements for the consular report of birth abroad, which means you have to show that your father in this situation has 5 years of physical presence in the US, they're US citizen, and oh, by the way, some of that time, physical presence cannot be under age 14. Okay, so you have to prove this. So even though that your father is deceased, you will still have to prove that your father met all the requirements. The U.S. Embassy is not going to basically give you a pass. Okay, they will still want you to meet every single requirement, and then you can get the passport, and then you can have the proof of citizenship. Okay. Um, if you're under 18, okay, if you're under 18 and you're not able to do the CRBA because your father did not have enough physical presence, you may want to consider an N600K, because an N600K is for people that, you know, maybe their parent did not meet the requirement or their parent is deceased, but they have a guardian that can do the process for them, or their grandparents have enough physical presence in the US to make up for their parents' lack of physical presence. So that is a whole other thing from a CRBA, but it is a way that a child can get their citizenship even if the parent has passed away. Hmm. I just want to make sure. So feel free to ask me questions in the comment. Mm. So just sticking to the same like type of questions. For the 5 years physical presence for CRBA, do they have to be 5 years straight in the US? Because I've been going out of the US every 2 years for business since I became a US citizen. So 5 years physical presence for CRBA is 5 years total, right? Not 5 years at a time. So you count all the time you've been in the US, you've physically been in the US. If it adds up to 5 years, then you have the physical presence. If it doesn't add up to the 5 years, then you do not have the physical presence. So if you're traveling for business every 2 years, you need to look at, for the times that you were physically in the US, do you have 5 years? If you do not, then CRBA would not be an option for you. But if you do, right, if you do, after doing the calculations, don't just look at the years, look at the days. Because when you go to do the CRBA application, it asks you how many days were you physically in the US. So you're given a date to a date. And every time you travel outside of the US, that's time that you're not going to count for the CRBA. So don't look at just, oh, I think I was in the US for 6 months. Well, what are the actual dates that you were in the US? Calculate the days, and that's what's going to help you determine if you meet the requirements. Okay. Okay. So remember, if you are joining me and you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the comments. And I wanted to cover this question. I just had to look for it real quick. What if hardship for yourself, since you're already situated in the US, removing you will cause emotional hardship and financial hardship? This is referring to a 601A or a 601 waiver. So when it comes to the hardship waivers, the hardship has to be to either your US citizen or permanent resident spouse or parent. Okay. The 601 waiver, the 601A waiver does not take into account your hardship unless you are applying based on the fact that you're, also applying for VAWA. If you are not applying for VAWA and you need a 601 waiver or a 601A waiver, your hardship to you is not going to be considered unless it directly results in hardship to your spouse or your parent. Okay. So it's just like if you have US citizen children and you're applying for a 601 waiver or a 601A waiver, hardship to them is not directly considered unless it also affects your US citizen spouse or your US citizen or permanent resident parent. Okay. That's when it would matter. Again, I'm not saying that hardship to your children don't matter. I'm saying on the waiver, there's no place to say my child will suffer these hardships. But there's a place to say that my parent will suffer hardship. There's a place to say that my spouse will suffer a hardship. But there's no place to say that my child will suffer a hardship for the hardship waivers. There's other types of waivers that children would be considered, but not a 601 waiver based on hardship or a 601A waiver. Okay, so hardship to yourself not considered unless you are also applying for VAWA. Hardship to children would not be considered unless it affects the spouse or the parent. Okay, it's really really strict on whose hardship can be considered. However, we know I'm a parent, right? I have 2 kids. If my kids are going to have a hardship, I'm going to have a hardship, right? So it's easy enough to show the direct impact of the hardship to the kids to the hardship to the spouse or the hardship to the parents, especially grandparents, right? So it's not that you can't use the hardship. You just have to be creative in the way that you explain the hardship, okay? All right. Speaking of waivers, my wife has been waiting for a year now for the 601A waiver. Why is this taking so long? Because USCIS is not prioritizing these cases and they are taking between 3 to 4 years for a 601A waiver to be approved, okay? It has nothing to do with your particular petition. It has nothing to do with your particular case unless there is a reason to expedite. And typically, a waiver case, in most situations, a 601A waiver, there is hardship, right? You're filing the waiver because there is hardship. Now, if you want them to speed up the process, you really need to show an emergency reason for them to do that, right? Because everyone else is saying, we really want this to move faster because we want our case approved so we can basically be done with this whole process. So if you want to move ahead of people that filed before you, you need to take the steps to show USCIS your hardship and to show what emergency, what's the urgency for them to move quickly. Sometimes, the US citizen spouse or parent being diagnosed with a really severe medical condition or a terminal illness will push those things ahead of others. And sometimes it doesn't. Okay. When it comes to expedite requests, it's really up to USCIS. With this administration, I would not suggest doing an expedite request unless you're also getting assistance from a congressperson. And this is something people overlook when they're thinking about their whole process. They don't think about getting help from their congressperson. It's easier in some states than others. I will say that. I have seen some Republican congresspeople not really be receptive to the idea of helping. However, like like I always say, I am based in Massachusetts, so I have seen that our Congress people are very receptive and very willing to help as much as they can, right? So, one thing I will say is do not be afraid to ask your congressperson for help if your case is taking longer than expected. All right. There's steps that you can take to ask them for help, and they're going to ask you for certain information. Provide them the information and get their assistance, because that is the only way they would actually help you, is if you give them the information they need to be able to reach out to USCIS on your behalf. Okay. Straight up expedites are still happening, but I wouldn't really rely on expedites to get cases moving. Now, with this administration, we are getting as much help as possible from congressmen that are around here, from senators. Like, we are getting as much help as possible with our cases, because especially when we know a case needs to be expedited, we need to take steps to get it expedited. So that's really the whole point here, is that we want to make sure that things are moving. Did I do this something with that? Okay. So feel free to ask me questions. Feel free to let me know. If you have any questions about this, if you found this video helpful, go ahead and hit that like button. And I will be seeing y'all in 2 weeks, because next week I have a green card interview with a client, so I will not be in the office, so I will not be able to set up for a live, just because of the timing of the interview. So I will be doing I will be at a USCIS interview next week Friday, so I would not have a live session. All right, so thank you all so much for joining me. I will see you in 2 weeks.